Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about what is a peg. So, if you remember, we talked about how pegs are basically digital versions of the analog peg bar that used to be used by traditional animators. Originally, they were meant to keep your sequence of animation on the paper registered so that one drawing would basically sync up with the next drawing after that. It was sort of an easy way to keep your animations all in one place. They would also use the peg bar to move the animation underneath the camera. So if you think of, for example, a peg layer as sort of it's like a bubble or a holder. So imagine that the animation on my paper is a bird flying, and I put it on a peg. And if you imagine that peg like a bubble around the bird, I could then move that peg, and that would then in turn move my animation along with the peg. So pegs are kind of like invisible layers that you can apply any transformable property to. So to add a peg, you have two different options. The first option is that with the layer selected, you can click on the Add Peg icon or Control Option P, and it's this little sort of orange semicircle plus sign right in your timeline. The other way you can do it is if you go to the plus menu and you go down, you can do Command or Option P, or you can just click that. If you get this error, if you try to do that and you get this error going, cannot add peg in this display mode, change to display all mode, don't panic. All you have to do is go up to Scene, Default Display, Display All, and that should resolve it. You should be able to add pegs with no problem at all. You can drag layers into pegs, so you can make a peg a parent of a layer just by drawing, clicking and dragging that drawing on top of the peg layer. Um, you can have many individual art layers within one peg. You can have many pegs inside one peg. The possibilities are really endless. You can really nest them as much as you would like to. Um, how to animate a peg. So again, pegs only work with transformable properties. These are things that you do to something to move it. It's not hand-drawn stuff, but it's things like size, position, rotation, skew, any of that stuff you can do to a peg. You can also do it to a camera because a camera goes onto a peg. Um, you can't do sort of hand-drawn stuff with pegs. They're just containers. They're just holders that you can do different transformable properties to. Again, when you see it in your timeline, it's going to look like an invisible layer. If you see here, traditional art layers are filled with gray, and that tells us that there's something on those cells. There's something taking up that space. With peg layers, there's nothing there. They're literally empty cells. All you see are keyframes and motion tweens because it's saying, here's a keyframe here and a keyframe here, and I'm moving it, but there's nothing in that layer. It's holding this layer down here. This is a thing that's being moved. And what it does is that it separates out the transformable properties from your animation or your drawing. So it keeps things a little neater and it makes it easier in the long run to organize your stuff and to fix mistakes. Obviously, you need to have your animate mode turned on and you use the transform tool to set the keys for the peg. Um, when you are using your selection, be very careful because it's very easy to mistakenly select your drawing layer. Um, and you can put keyframes on that drawing layer if you're not careful. There is a way to go into properties and to turn that transformable ability off, but by default, it's not turned off. So you have to be really careful because you can end up with double keyframes on both your art layers and your peg layers, and it just becomes super insane. You know you have a peg selected when the area on the stage is highlighted in yellow. You get a yellow tint to everything when you have a peg selected. If looks pink and magenta, that means you have the drawing layer selected and not the peg. When in doubt, you can hit B and that should sort of jump you up to the next layer. It should jump you up to the parent. So if you're on a drawing layer and you hit B, it should pop you up to the peg layer. If you want to go down the chain, if you want to go from the peg layer to the art layer for replacement animation, for example, you would go Shift B to go down the chain. There is under the selection mode with your transform tool, peg selection mode. So under your tool properties, it looks like a little cursor with the orange semicircle. And what that does is that if it's given the choice between a drawing layer and a peg layer, it will choose the peg layer. So it's a very good thing to have chosen if you are working with a very advanced rig. A lot of people actually they actually animate within the node view and select the pegs that way just to kind of confuse anything. To set the pivot point on a peg, you do not use the drawing pivot tool. We use something completely different because harmony. What you're going to do is use what's called the special animation tools. You can use any of them, but people like the rotation one the best. You would just take the rotation tool and you're going to center that pivot where you want it, and that will center the pivot of the peg. The drawing pivot and the peg pivot have nothing to do with each other. So every time you set a peg pivot, every time you add a new peg, you have to kind of reset that peg's pivot. You can also view the path of action with your peg. So I call them little railroad tracks. They're above your stage and these look like an orange and a white sort of, hash marks like that. Once you have movement keyed out, if you select those, the orange one is toggle it on, the white is toggle it off, you can actually see the motion path of your peg. And so you can see the ease in, ease out, you can see where your keyframes are, and you can actually move these points around to manipulate the path of action of your object. It's a quick little slideshow there. So here we have some pegs right here, and I don't know, hopefully it's going to record this. So let me pause. So here we have just our artwork layers. So what I want to do is first I want to put pegs on them. So I can shift select them and just click this, and it's going to put a peg onto every single, oh, I put a peg on my text layer. Oopsie. And if I look at my transform, you'll see that the pivot is not set correctly. So if you remember, we go up here to then set the pivot correctly right there. For the square is pretty set already. The star, we want it to be right here. And the text, honestly, why not? Here's the text, ta-da! And if I wanted, I could then put these 3 pegs. So say for the star, I want to set it to be rotating. So with the peg selected, I am going to have it go from here, and I'm just going to have it, actually, let me do something more interesting. I'm going to have it squash and stretch. So it's going to go whoop, whoop, like that. And let's see, something with the square. Let's go skew and skew. Oh, see how it's pink? So if I hit B, that's the peg. Shift B down to the drawing layer. And here you'll see as I add, when I added all those pegs, you saw that each drawing layer in the node view had the peg then added to it. Let me finish this little skew ball. There we go. So we have skew, skew, skew. And with the ball, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a rotation. So say, for example, I just want to rotate it like that. So I can actually hide the peg and it will show me just the object but not the animation. So you can hide the transformable property of the animation. If I wanted, over my node view and go Command or Control P, I can just add a peg here and I can actually put the star, the square, and the circle all as children of the sort of the master peg, as it were. So with this peg, what I could do is have everything go from the bottom of the screen to the top of the screen. So all that movement is basically embedded and then parented to this movement right here. Another really cool thing, so if I add another peg, so I'm going to call this circle peg rotation because I'm going to show you something. So with this peg, if I just hold down Alt, I can stick it in between here and here, and now my circle's on another peg. My peg is on a sub-peg. Take my advanced rotation tool, recenter it. So here, for example, and if I wanted to, I could hide the rotation. So here is the rotation. So maybe with this peg, I'm going to give it a little bit of a wobble up and down. So basically a little bit of a squash and stretch. If you kind of imagine it to be maybe like a wheel or something, I don't know. So it's like that. So I'm just going to copy this frame and paste it. Copy and paste and copy and paste. So now it's kind of doing this sort of squash and stretch while it's doing the rotation. So it's rotating and squashing and stretching at the same time. Now, I'm going to call this peg squash and stretch, S and S. And let's throw another peg in here. Option P, throw another peg in. This peg can be skew. So say you wanted to have this in perspective. Recenter this peg's pivot right here. Take this and you could kind of skew it in perspective. And now it's rotating in perspective with that sort of squash and stretch. If you imagine doing this in the wrong order, if I try to do this just with the art layer, I would have like an egg rolling around because that skew would be applied to the rotation. But the rotation is separate and I can actually hide the rotation if I want and just isolate out the other stuff. But basically each peg you can kind of isolate out what transformable property you want to use for it. So again, pegs are a very powerful tool, especially when you start doing advanced puppet and rigging, and they can really be a lifesaver in terms of keeping your workflow clean and sort of streamlined. So a little bit on pegs.